Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us to celebrate and recognize International Women's Day. I'm Jamie Ramacati, Head of Content for Student Events at THE, and I have the privilege of moderating today's discussion with an incredible panel of women in higher education leadership. The theme of International Women's Day this year is Choose to Challenge, a call to action to challenge gender bias and inequality, and to seek out and celebrate women's achievements. The first International Women's Day was in 1911, and since then there has been so much progress in advancing women's equality, but there are still challenges to face, and International Women's Day provides us with a great opportunity to reflect on how far we've come and to think about the work still to be done. We hope today's event will be just a small part of how you each choose to recognize and honor the spirit of International Women's Day. Today, we want to specifically talk about International Women's Day in the context of higher education. We know that education is a huge factor in leveling the playing field, and we've seen extraordinary strides in gender equality within the higher education landscape. Through our discussion today, we want to celebrate those achievements and speak about the transformative power of higher education and the role that universities play in supporting and highlighting the achievements of women. I'd like to especially thank Study Group for sponsoring our event today. And before we jump into the panel discussion, I'd like to introduce Emma Lancaster, CEO of Study Group. Emma has been the CEO of Study Group since September 2018, having previously served as the CFO since 2013. Study Group is a leading provider of international education, driving success for their partners and students, and committed to creating a better world through education. I'll hand it over to Emma for a few remarks before we introduce the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Jamie. And just to say, as a company that's committed to international education, we really see the transformational effects of it and the opportunity it provides. So in the context of women around the world, we're delighted to host this or help host this discussion, because I think there are many themes that we'll cover today that kind of impact the things that we are doing and the opportunities that it gives our students.
Great, thank you. I now have the privilege of introducing the rest of our panel. We have with us today Fanta Av, Vice President of Campus Life and Inclusive Excellence at American University in Washington, D.C. Fanta has spent 25 years in higher education administration. She's also the School of International Services Hearst Senior Professorial Lecturer, teaching graduate courses related to immigration, internationalization of higher education, and international higher education policy. She's the past president and chair of the board of directors of NAFSA, the Association of International Educators. We're also joined by Wendy Alexander, Vice Principal International at the University of Dundee. Wendy leads the university's international strategy and engagement, which includes delivering the university's strategic priorities for internationalization and ensuring an outstanding experience for all international students. She also spent over a decade of her career in government and politics. She served in the first 3 Scottish cabinets, including as minister with responsibility for further and higher education. And Jess Wade, research fellow at Imperial College. Her research has been published in scientific journals such as the Journal of Physical Chemistry, the Journal of the American Chemical Society, the Journal of Materials Chemistry, and several more. In addition to her research, she is a champion of gender equality in STEM subjects, and she spends a significant amount of time writing and editing Wikipedia biographies for women and people of color scientists. A note quickly to our audience, if you have any questions for the panelists, please do submit them using the Q&A box. We'll try to get to some of them throughout the event. And of course, a big thank you to all of our panelists for being here with us on International Women's Day. I'd like to start with a pretty straightforward question, and Wendy, we'll begin with you, I think. Can you just start by telling us what International Women's Day means to you and why having this conversation today feels important?
It's a wonderful day to celebrate. For those who know about these things, International Women's Day has been around for about 110 years, but maybe pertinent to this conversation, the first time it really meant something to me was when I went to university, which was almost 40 years ago now, so I'm the oldest on the panel. And I got involved in the women's group in campus, and it was my introduction to things like rape crisis centres or childcare on campus, or reclaim the night marches, that sort of thing. And it's shaped my whole life and upbringing since that. I found last night when I was looking at this little postcard, which nobody can read, but it was from 1981, and it said, "Dear sirs, man to man, manpower, craftsman, man in the street, history of mankind, forefathers, masterpiece, the brotherhood of man." You get the idea. And I say, 40 years on, we do all stand on our mother's shoulders. It is one day a year when we say we are making progress. The arc of progress bends long, but we're getting there. And I can't wait to have a young generation of new women coming and being part of, the women's group at institutions all over the world, because it is the way that we really make change for the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I saw some nodding heads from the other panelists when you talked about, going to university being, some of your first exposure to the importance and really sort of fully understanding what this means. Fanta, do you want to add anything about what International Women's Day means to you and why having these conversations today is so important?
Sure, no, thank you for having me. I would say, Jamie, I think every day should be International Women's Day. So I start from that premise, but then also understand that we have this gift of this one day where we can pause. And so I would say on a personal level, really what it means to me is really being able to stand on the shoulders of giants such as my grandmother, my mother, but also frankly on the shoulders of my father, who's the first feminist that I ever met. And so that's part of it on a personal level. And then I would say on a professional level, I think as Wendy said, knowing what this means in education and issues of access is something that is near and dear to my heart. And it's an opportunity to pause. It's an opportunity for us to really, in many ways, look at the facts of where we've come, how far we've come, and yet how much further we have to go. And really, for me, being excited about passing the baton on to the next generation. I'm hopeful and I'm incredibly excited when I talk to the young women and men on my campus and know that they really are looking to the future in a way that I think is bright and where we hopefully will be making much more progress faster than we've had over the last century.
Yeah, great. You mentioned access and what it means specifically to education. And Emma, I'd like to turn to you. I think, in different ways, everyone on this panel has committed your careers to making education more accessible and to breaking down barriers, not only for women, but for everyone to have access to education. How have you seen specifically opportunities for women kind of coming to the forefront in higher education, and what are some examples of ways that we feel like higher education is really celebrating women?
So I think it's building on the shoulders of others. I think it was the phrase, which is, if you look back over time, the proportion of senior women coming through, the proportion that you see in terms of female vice chancellors, which, roll back a period of time you absolutely wouldn't have seen, all the way through in every level. And I look at my own organisation, we have more and more women coming through in terms of senior roles, which I think makes a big difference. But then I think when you think about the international and the opportunities that gives, and actually more experience of different cultures and the ability to bring people and give them access that way, I think has been, really formative. And you see that in all the students coming through. And I guess it's the same thing. I look forward and go, okay, what will this be like in 10 years, in 20 years? Because I know how far we've come.
Great. Jess, what from a sort of research perspective and from the world that you work in, what are you seeing in terms of increased visibility of the achievements of women, increased opportunities, particularly in research for women?
I think it's a really complicated question to be asking now, because I think we've all seen, we've had such upheaval in our lives in the last year, and that has disproportionately impacted women's careers, particularly in sciences and in medicine, access to labs, having to do homeschooling, not having the opportunities that you would have otherwise. We've seen huge decreases in the number of applications women are making for funding, and also the number of papers that women are publishing. So we seem to have made all these great advances that have been described by my esteemed panel, but the pandemic has really put a pause on that, and that's something I think that we should reflect upon. But certainly I'm seeing everything that Fanta and Wenda and Emma have mentioned, you know, this call from a younger research community who really want change, who want that access to childcare on campus, who want double-blind peer review so they're not discriminated against just for the fact that they have a women's name. But I also see, and I'd be interested in if the audience agrees, the international audience, this kind of inertia at the top. You know, there are people who are still at the top of these incredibly privileged institutions who have these really high profile and high importance roles, who either don't see women's representation or people of color's representation as an issue. You know, they don't think that there could be structural sexism or racism in their communities. But also they don't really want it to change because these issues have supported their careers the whole time, and they don't really want to have to leave their fancy office or stop publishing in Nature and Science. So it's kind of, you've got this very young, enthusiastic, confident calling for change. And then you have people in positions of power who aren't quite happy to sit with that yet. And hopefully everyone on this call will join our advocacy to make academia and higher education a better place. But that's where I'm seeing it at the moment.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear from other panelists about, and from you, Jess, also, like what steps can we take? What can we do to make sure that we are really participating in the advocacy for change? I mean, I think, you know, Fanta said every day should be International Women's Day, and I think it is great that we have these conversations today and that we celebrate the achievements of women and we talk about how far we've come. But I think there are also things that we should all be doing every day to make sure that we're making progress, that we're not just checking in on this once a year, but that we're really heeding that call to choose to challenge, and that we're really actively participating in this 365 days a year. So I would love to hear from others on the panel about things that you feel like we can all be doing to advance that.
Yeah. I think Jess really started it, and you really, as a sociologist, I would be remiss if I did not talk about structural issues, right? I think I would be failing in my role in that. And so I would say absolutely, as we've seen progress, we know that every progress has come at a cost. And we know that it's been really pushing hard for change. And it is absolutely the case that we cannot be naive to the structures that exist and the structures that continue to be impediment to progress. And so whether we look at it at our institutions, whether we look at it in any form of institutions, our ability to really understand where decisions are being made and who's at the table and who's actually making decisions that affect the lives of the majority of people, this is where change needs to happen. And so from my perspective, until we actually get more women to the table at the highest level of organizations, and until we're able to really influence policies, practices, and cultures of organizations and institutions, change will be slow. And in some cases, there will be continuing to be a push against change. And so I will say that the structures really do matter tremendously. And our ability to also understand intersectionality is incredibly important, because women were not monolithic a group. And so understanding what's the intersection of race, what's the intersection of, sexual orientation, what's the intersection of, of socioeconomic class, nationality, all of those things really matter. And so as women, it's incredibly important that we continue to do the hard work that is needed.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear also, Wendy, from you, and Fanta and Emma, also from you, about what you're seeing at the universities that you work with, kind of, boots on the ground, figuratively, because some of you may not be actually on campus, but, just kind of what kinds of strides are you seeing? Particularly, I'm interested in learning more about what you're seeing in your student body that is promising to you in terms of, seeing sort of those waves of change, and what you're seeing from those university-aged men and women who are, doing things that are inspiring and hopeful, and and making us really feel like we're heading in the right direction. Wendy, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, listening to conversation, it is about the complexity of the moment that we're at now, because at one level, I mean, the Times Higher Education today published about the number of women leaders, and there are more women leaders in higher education institutions than you find in other walks of life. And you know, it's amazing that you've got, you know, Louise Richardson reading Oxford and Alice Gast at Imperial and Minosh Shafiq at LSE. I mean, they're three of Britain's fantastic higher education institutions, and they are providing role models that would have been unthinkable when I started 40 years ago. But yet, equally, as Fanta says, the structural issues which young women come to university with a knowledge of. I mean, similarly today, the UN was pointing out to us all in the context of the sustainability goals that, you know, globally, 3/4 of MPs are still men, and 75% of managers, and most of the climate change negotiators, and most of the people around the peace table are all men. So what do young women do with that? And I think if you look back in the last year, the two big issues, one of which we've alluded to so far, is COVID, and women are still doing 3/4 of the domestic labor, and in every walk of life that has been catastrophically hard for women trying to maintain those dual careers. And I think if you look back, we would have thought we would have made more progress on the domestic labour front. We were having this conversation so for the younger generation, it is, how do we make that burden of domestic caring easier? But the other one that we've just alluded to slightly is obviously Black Lives Matter. I mean, that was the moment of this year, other than COVID. And there, I think, rightly, we are being challenged by our students on all sorts of dimensions, and rightly so, because we've been remiss, whether that's been on decolonizing the curriculum, whether it is who do we have statues to and why do we have statues to them, whether it is on the race equality charter, whether it is on what we are doing around equity of access. There is just a raft of challenging issues where we are rightly, the young generation are saying. The one I haven't touched on obviously is climate change, but my daughter, the site of her radicalism is climate change strikes, and that whole generation is going to be arriving on our campuses this autumn. So it seems to me they are challenging us in positions of administration on the right issues, on why, you know, unless you change the power structures, that fight goes on. Unless you make the domestic work burden easier, what are you doing to save this planet? And why is it that we have this shameful record on recognition of ethnic communities in higher education across the piece at every level, from, you know, student unions through to presidents? So it's an exciting time, and there's no shortage of causes for women who are arriving this autumn to make us a better place.
And I think it is, you know, in some ways it's refreshing to have these conversations in the context of higher education and university life, because universities so often are the center of so much change and, you know, just passion around these subjects. And so I think, you know, there are so many other contexts within which we could have these conversations, but university life and university age students and their drive and their zest for creating change makes it just a really special context to have these types of conversations in. Jess, yeah, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Wendy's just said. I mean, it's so interesting when you look at the kind of history of this. It's only in the last, you know, in countries like the UK, it's only in the last 100 years that women have legally been allowed to attend and graduate from university. There's kind of fascinating books, if you get interested in the history of women scientists, how about kind of the beginning of the 1900s and during the suffrage movement and the fight for women's right to vote, women were taken into science labs because men went off to the war and were phenomenally productive and phenomenally resourceful and made all these discoveries, but weren't actually allowed to graduate because the law didn't let women graduate at the time. So we've only had women's rights to be in panels like this and be involved in higher education for the last 100 years. But kind of coming back to what Fanta was saying about structural inequality and changing things, putting people from diverse backgrounds who think differently in positions of power has a huge impact on not only the diversity of our student communities and our researchers, but also the discoveries that we make, you know, the science that we do, the questions that we ask, the calls for climate change, people looking at pollution in urban environments, people thinking differently about how we analyze information from the pandemic from a kind of socioeconomic perspective. That needs diverse people at the top, and we're seeing it now. There's an amazing inspirational program that I'm sure Fanta knows about, but in the University of Maryland, the Mayhoff Scholars Program, and that has created so many extraordinary Black scientists and researchers. One of the scholars who graduated from that program is Kizzy Corbett, who is the NIH researcher who's developed the Moderna vaccine, so the vaccine against coronavirus. She's about 34, and she's, you know, leading the reason we can all emerge from lockdown. And that's through one program designed to support minority scholars of extraordinary ability. And that's led and pioneered by someone who is typically not represented in academia. And I think we have to look at those kind of initiatives, and we have to say what's working and how can we emulate that. And that's something that I think academia around the world, higher education around the world, could get a lot better at doing.
Yeah, Emma, please.
So I think the point about diversity is really well made, and I think if you're looking for reasons to be positive, I look at our students. So our students are international, they come from 145 countries. You know, it is not quite 50-50 male female, but we're certainly much closer. And when I look at the women coming through from hugely diverse backgrounds, from China, from Egypt, from Middle East, from Vietnam, a whole range of different, and you see what they then go on to do, both here or in the US or in Australia, but then back in their home countries, and the things that they go on to see. And I think that is what gives me the confidence that the world is changing. And I think when you also look at the things you can learn from cross cultures and the things that you see, because I think the point around childcare is a really interesting one. And actually, when childcare is dealt with in different ways potentially than the way we deal with it here, you see that there are masses of opportunities. And I look at China in particular and look at the number of senior women that I see in my counterparts in business and what have you, and go, there is so much more that we can learn from other cultures and the other ways of doing that we need to bring back. And that's why when you see these students coming through and you ask originally, you know, what can they bring, I think a sense of what they're bringing, their enthusiasm, the things that they want to do. But it's that diversity point. You won't get everybody.
Emma, you've beautifully answered a question that had actually come in from the audience, saying, you know, this is International Women's Day, and we really should also be talking about what can women learn from each other and from the experiences of other women with other experiences and other points of view and other challenges. I mean, I think that's one of the other things that we can celebrate today and discuss, is that there's so much to be learned from the experiences of other people and the challenges that others have faced in different circumstances, but equally the successes and the things that are working. You know, Jess, the example that you gave, and saying, like, maybe if we can all learn from that type of model, we can then create more opportunities for other people to succeed and thrive and have even more to celebrate. I want to briefly talk, because I know that we definitely have some men in the audience today. And first of all, thanks for joining us for our International Women's Day discussion. But I'd like to talk about what we feel like men can do specifically in the higher education landscape to help all of these things that we've been talking about, because I think sometimes it can really feel like the burden to address these issues or to come up with solutions for these problems is on the people who are facing the issues. But actually, it's sort of on the whole institution to come up with solutions that work for everyone. And it's in everyone's best interest to make sure that we are solving these problems. Fanta, do you want to start and just talk about you know, some things that we feel like collectively everyone can be doing, including men?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I mean, I think, the solutions, I think like many solutions will require all of us investing the time, investing the energy, and believing that change is possible and change can happen. And that will take women and it will definitely take men as well. I think I see on our campuses, and I think we've seen in many other instances, a lot of the movements that we've seen in recent times are movements that are not only involving women, it's involving men. And I think that speaks volume about the fact that it's going to take all of us. I think, on a basic level, one of the things that is unique about higher education relative to other sectors, it's really about knowledge. It's about knowledge, but it's about applied knowledge. What do you do with the knowledge that you've acquired in order to basically, initiate change? And so the first thing I would say to the men in the audience is that all of us need to challenge the ways we've been socialized, the ways we've been taught to believe certain things. We need to challenge ourselves in relations to that. And so that's the first starting point. Really dare to know. And then once you dare to know, dare to be an agent of change. Those are the two things that I say to my students every single day. Um, I think for students who are coming to our universities, wherever from the world you're coming from, and irrespective of how challenging it is, this is an enormous privilege that you have to have access to higher education. It is not afforded to everyone, even in all of our societies. And so I would say those to whom much is given, much is expected. And so to our students, that would be the starting point for our men and also for our women.
Yeah, absolutely. Jess, did you want to add something?
I just think that's such powerful words. And I really echo that. It's a phenomenal privilege to be doing something that you love, to be studying something that you love. And I think that every day as a scientist, we have a responsibility to take this science or this enthusiasm to the world and communicate it. And I think that particularly men, particularly white men in positions of power in university, have to use their privilege and change that platform and lift others up. And I think they can do it. It can be in small ways, right? You can use this power to look at who you're inviting to give seminars, look at the way that you write references for jobs or prospective students, look at the ways that you do interviews, look at how we're evaluating people. If we have this structural inequality, if we have this bias, we need to change the way that we evaluate students and we evaluate researchers so that we're much more fair and equal on people coming in. But I think something that you touched on in the introduction to this section was looking at kind of how women, and particularly women of color, often take on this burden. This is time out of their job. It's not usually time that they're paid to do. It's something they're doing from the goodness of their own heart. So I think something that men can really do is to share that, is to be on these committees, to be pushing and calling for this change, to be taking the time out of their schedule to be on panels like this and have these discussions, because otherwise it's only women's, and particularly women's of color's, careers that are going to be limited by doing this. And to finally, I guess I could talk about this forever, to kind of give up their space, right? If you're invited to give a lecture or a plenary or a keynote at some kind of huge event, look at the women who haven't been invited and make the opportunity available to them as well, because it's really hard to make your entry or make your way into academia wherever you are in the world, particularly so in other countries. And if you've got that privilege that Fanta was describing, you have a kind of responsibility to share that with others. So when you do get to those positions of power, whether you're a white man or probably a white woman, you've really got to share that phenomenal opportunity you have.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to turn a little bit to speak specifically to the audience that is here that are prospective international students. Students who are maybe just kind of on the precipice of that next step of their education journey, thinking about studying abroad, thinking about leaving their home country. And we've talked already a little bit about, the value and the importance of being at a university and being surrounded by people who think differently than you and who have different experiences than you have. But Emma, I wonder if it's something that you want to talk about, just sort of the value in that study abroad experience, particularly for women. And even though it may be, some women may find themselves in a position, that it's challenging for them to get abroad, or that education is not as highly valued in their home country as it might be in other places. What words of advice or encouragement would you share in terms of, persevering because of the value of that experience?
I think primarily just that, is to persevere. I mean, I would say that, you know, studying abroad, it's not just the academic. In fact, I would say that's a slither of what you can. It's the sharing the cultures, it's understanding what others are like, it's building networks, it's building friends, it's building that network that will keep you, you know, as you go forward. And as you return to your home country, having that network internationally really affords you opportunities to make a difference in your own country or in your own life or work or any of those things, because you can build those bridges, those cultural bridges. So it's really tough. I mean, it's a big step. It's a massive to go, you know, 1,000 miles away to a different country. It feels like it's really hard, but it is so worthwhile. And when I look at our students and I look at what they go on to be in the careers they have, might be in their home country, often is in their home country, but often with a network of others across countries. And you see this, you know, I mean, going back to the higher education sector, you know, you see this all the time in the networks, and it's that spark of creativity because you're working with somebody as a university at another side of the world, and you have to have that sort of international outlook and that ability to build cross-cultural bridges. So, you know, absolutely in some countries it is tougher to kind of get the support for education, but really persevere because it is so worthwhile. You know, I don't think any of us around this panel would be where we are today without the education that was afforded to us through the universities we went to. And so, yeah, we do everything you can to make that investment.
Yeah, of course. I should add that, you know, in the interest of time, in the brief bios that I gave for each of you, I did not mention your education background, but of course, all of you, you know, lean on the education opportunities that you had that got you to where you are today. Wendy, I know you studied abroad and in a few places, and I'm sure that was a transformative experience for you. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about it?
So I went abroad at 16. I completely loved it. And I spent 10 of the next 20 years overseas. I agree with everything Emma says. Often I think for women, you know, there's a desire by the family sometimes to say, maybe you should wait for your master's. And I just say, look at some of those women change makers out there. You know, Malala wasn't 16 when she started shaking up the world, and nor was Greta Thunberg. You're old enough to go if you feel ready to go. And I guarantee it will change your life forever in positive ways. I used to work later on in my career at London Business School, and we used to say for women who wanted to go into business, it's sometimes harder because of family commitments later in life to have those international experiences, but it can really help to get those international experiences in early. So there's good career reasons to do it. But also there are just great personal reasons to it. You become a global citizen. You have friends from all over the world who you still connect with. At my age, 40 years later, you're still connecting with the people you met. But also I think it makes you a global citizen because you see home differently. I remember, I'll just end on this anecdote. I remember in Canada meeting this fantastic guy from Australia who said, well, you know, his parents came from Glasgow, but because of religious division in Glasgow, there were being bottles smashed in his parents' faces because they came from different sides of a religious divide and they're free left. Or the Muslim guy that I fell completely in love with, age 17, who had been hounded out of it, was after the invasion of Afghanistan first time round, had come to the part of Scotland I knew well and suffered the most appalling racism and relocated on to Toronto. And they were completely formative experiences saying, I need to look at my world that I regard as safe and secure and comfortable differently. And it stays with you forever. So it's a fantastic thing to do. Don't leave it too late. If you have the chance, take it. You will not regret it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I'm sure everyone on the panel echoes those sentiments, that it is just such a worthwhile experience, and to persevere if you're feeling like it's something that's out of reach. You know, there are so many resources to help students who want to have that international study experience to make sure that it's a reality. We've got about 10 minutes left, and one of the things that has come up in the questions from the audience that I want to make sure we address is, and it kind of relates to the theme of this year's International Women's Day, choose to challenge, and that idea that it's kind of everyone's responsibility to call out circumstances that we feel are biased or unfair or not promoting equity? And there's a couple of questions that have come in from the audience that relate to these kinds of issues. And one of them just saying, you know, how do we deal with casual sexism when we experience it? How do, when we see these, you know, these things happening, or it's happening to us in the workplace or in school, or, you know, wherever it may be happening, what advice would you give to women about calling out those circumstances and moving forward from them so that they really feel like they're affecting change, rather than saying, man, that really was awful, and just moving on from it? Jess, do you want to start with that one?
It's a really, really hard question. And it's even harder if you think about being an international student in a new country where you may not have the support networks that you're used to. But I would say, I think probably I've got a bit of a reputation for calling these kind of things out, that you have to find a supportive group around you who amplify and kind of champion what you're saying, whether it's people in your undergraduate class or in your master's class or in your research group when you're doing your PhD, whatever level you're at. Find that little group of kind of advocates and cheerleaders who can amplify it and say, hey, you know, that was completely out of line, or that was completely uncalled for. There was an amazing story about women in Obama's White House, because women were very underrepresented, but had phenomenal ideas and were leading, you know, all of these different initiatives. And there was kind of like an echo chain of amplifying women's messages until they got to the top and got read and seen by Obama. So it's kind of like you have women there in the room saying these things and calling it out, and then you have your male ally or more senior women ally who amplifies what you've said and says that behavior is bad or that idea is fantastic. And we need to be able to build those things. I would say that to find, you know, particularly if you're an international student, finding that community of other students that may be from the same country or the same background as you, so that you have that network to embed into. And when you've got that, you'll feel a lot more confident. And I recognize that this has been such a weird year and everything has been online and we've not been able to build those personal relationships. But I would try wherever you can to make those, and to reach out to university support services as well if you need that kind of thing. You know, if you need to speak to a personal tutor, if you need to speak to someone about sexual harassment or bullying, there are people in the institutions that you're attending who'll be able to give really specific and good advice. And you've just got to be able to make that leap and that jump to do it. My mum is a psychiatrist and she works in student mental health now. And so much of what she does, I think, is connecting students to these resources that are already in universities. You just don't know where to look. So my kind of big things would be to go through your university website, find where you can go to report instances of this kind of behavior, make sure that you're not alone, make sure that you're supported and surrounded by people, but really don't let that kind of ridiculousness impact your dream and your aspiration to become a scientist or a researcher or a scholar or whatever you want to be. Because of all the reasons we've said, this generation are changing things and desperately need you in it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And I think you're right about the resources. I think it can be really hard to advocate for yourself or advocate for the things that you believe in if you feel like you're doing it in a vacuum, but sort of understanding that there are groups of people out there who have the same, you know, contextual understanding of these issues that you have because they're coming from the same or similar backgrounds, but also understanding that there are so many resources and organizations available to you, you know, within universities that can support you is incredibly helpful. There's another question that came in from the audience that I want to make sure we address, and basically asking, like, how much do we think women sort of get in our own ways, and referring specifically to imposter syndrome. And I think we probably all have found ourselves at some point or another in a situation going, what am I doing here? Am I really qualified to be doing this? Do I really have the necessary expertise? Fanta, I saw you nodding when I said that. I think it's a great issue to talk about, and I think it's important that we sort of address, like, how do you combat imposter syndrome, and how do you make sure you're not getting in your own way as a woman, you know, in the workplace or at university?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to name it, right? And I think it's important to name the fact that imposter syndrome is real and it does exist. The second thing is I often go back and I remind myself and remind our students, it is incredibly important in whatever environment you're in, you have to find one person who believes in you. And you need to make sure you surround yourself in that sense with greatness. And by greatness, I mean someone who can uplift you, Because I often say one of the things that gets in our way a lot of times are the voices in our heads that tell us you're not good enough, you can't do this, etc., and so forth. And yet we know, and I've seen this time and time again, that by the time we decide to jump in, we're jumping in 150, 200%. And a lot of times I see, sometimes our male colleagues, oh, they're 50%, they're ready to go. And so I say to the young women, when you think you're not ready, you're more than ready. You're more than ready is really the second part of this. But you really do need to find at least one person that can serve as a mentor, one person that can uplift you, and one person that believes in you and is willing to invest in your success. I think that's incredibly important. You don't need many people, but you need at least one. And so find who that person is on your campus. And if it's not in your campus, find it in the communities in which you are. And as someone who's been an international student pretty much my entire life, it is something that I come back to again and again. And so I would say to the women who are listening, believe in yourself because you're deserving, you're worthy of it.
Please go ahead.
It's just so much easier to be objective about other people than it is about yourself. And so having that small group, somebody who can say, well, what do you think? Because everybody else, and you can see it in other people. And so I make sure that I do that with other people a lot and go, yes, you have that. And then expect, that some of that comes back to me, because I think everybody does it. Everybody goes, well, am I not quite ready for it? And there's so much research on the job market and all the rest of it. And it's exactly that point. But having that small group who can uplift you is so, so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on those encouraging words to, believe in yourself, don't self-select yourself out of opportunities, and to make sure that you're surrounding yourself with people who believe in you and are going to support you and uplift you. I want to thank you all, first to the audience for joining us today, for taking time out of your day to join us for this conversation about International Women's Day. I think it's important to reiterate what we said at the beginning, which is that, yes, today is just one day, but it's really our responsibility and our privilege to have these conversations every day and to be mindful of not only the accomplishments and the achievements of women, but also the challenges and the struggles that we still face in many circumstances, and to be willing and open to learn from each other and learn from the experiences of others. So a massive thanks to the audience for being here. And of course, a massive thanks to our panelists. It was really a privilege to have you guys here today. And I know that we could spend hours talking about inspiring stories and advice. And I think this has just been a really empowering and uplifting way to recognize the day. And as I said when we started, I hope it's just a small part of how everyone here chooses to acknowledge and honor the spirit of International Women's Day. So with that, a big thanks to everyone, and we'll see you next time.